Hi there, this is AP Economics for international students. We're going to look at the 2011 number 1 macro question today. It is a 5-part question. It's quite long. And we're going to look at 3 different graphs: the Phillips curve, the ADAS, and the money market. It's a fairly long question. So for this kind of question, the best approach is not to get intimidated, not to get too worried, but to start by just looking at the opening conditions, the scenario, and go through it step by step, filling out each part, trying to build on the earlier parts. So let's first look at the vocabulary here. This is a international student-focused video, so we're going to look at the English vocabulary first. So I'm just going to scroll down here. You can see I've highlighted what I think are the key words that may or may not be familiar. We've got some general vocabulary like assume. So the question tells us to assume that the U.S. economy is currently in a recession and a short-run equilibrium. So assume here is a verb, and it's just asking us to take as given. Okay, it's often used as the beginning of a question. It's telling you the foundation or the starting point for a question. Okay. Recession, we should know that this is a period of economic contraction, usually defined as 2 consecutive quarters, 2 times 3 months or 6 months. If you're watching this in 2022, you'll know that recently there has been some debate about whether or not the U.S. economy is actually in recession. What else do we have here? We've got the terms long-run equilibrium. We've got the Phillips curve. So long-run equilibrium, you will know, is when you are operating at a sustainable output. You would show this on your ADAS graph with the LRAS, the long-run aggregate supply curve. You would have your aggregate demand, that's your AD, and your aggregate supply, that's your AS. You would have both of them intersecting on the LRAS. That shows you are in long-run equilibrium. Okay, and this is the amount that the economy can produce sustainably. And when we draw the graph, we're going to see that this is going to be knocked out of equilibrium in one way or another, and this is almost always the beginning of an ADAS related question. So in the case of this question, we've actually got an economy that's in recession, so that means that our short run aggregate supply curve is going to intersect our aggregate demand curve, not on the LRAS curve. Remember, the LRAS, the long-run aggregate supply curve, is a vertical up and down curve. So it's going to be located to the left. That intersection, where those lines cross, will be located to the left of the LRAS, okay, which is a pretty common starting point. Part A also mentions the Phillips curve. We'll look at that in a moment. That is the relationship between inflation and unemployment. The next word here, we've got output and price level. So this is just for labeling your X and your Y axes. So on your ADAS graph, typically people will put real GDP or RGDP on the X axis. However, in some textbooks, you'll also see output, and certainly you'll see output in the question stems in many AP and other econ questions. Price level, that's going to be on your y-axis, and that shows changes in, that shows the price level, and we're going to show how the price level changes when those short-run curves shift one way or the other. Okay, and one thing to remember here is just to label your macro graphs with macro nomenclature, macro words, so that you're not mixing them up with your micro labeling. because you do get a couple of easy marks for just labeling your graphs. Okay, balance here, that is a verb, and it's talking about balancing the federal budget. So we can see from the original question stem that we're looking at the U.S. economy. And so the federal budget is just another way of saying the national government's budget, not the state or the city. The U.S. is a federal system. Government spending, we know, is one of the tools in our fiscal policy. Increasing it will increase AD, decreasing it will shift AD to the left. The Federal Reserve, or the Fed, that is going to be that is part of Part D, and that is where we intervene to affect interest rates in order to stimulate or to reduce aggregate demand. And I will talk about how this approach here, looking at open market operations, has been updated on the College Board exams for AP. So stimulate means to encourage or to create more of something, to grow our aggregate demand in this case. Open market policy, that is going to be, in this question, this is from 2011, this is going to involve the buying and selling of securities like bonds to influence the interest rate, which in turn will affect interest rate sensitive consumption and investment. Implement just means to put into place. It's a verb. To put into effect, to execute, you might also see. Instead is a relatively simple word. It suggests a change in meaning. So rather than doing something, you do something else. Instead of doing something, you do something else. In this case, taking no policy action. So take action means to do something, to implement something. And we've got long run as a noun. Notice there's no hyphen, there's no little dash. And short run, in this case, it's an adjective. So we're going to put that hyphen in there. And the last term in the entire question is the natural rate of unemployment, which you may know as the NRU. So the main thing to remember about the NRU is that it includes frictional and structural unemployment. So it doesn't mean zero. Zero unemployment is not the natural rate. It's the sustainable level of unemployment in the economy. And we exclude cyclical related to the business cycle, the economic cycle. And we will see in the last part of the question how it is going to be affected or not affected, as the case may be, by these different actions that we're going to look at in this question. So let's go and have a look at the first part, which is drawing a Phillips curve. So let's look at that first. So let's carry on and look at the Phillips curve graph here that I've drawn here, rather messily, but nevertheless it's good enough. So we've got the inflation rate. I've written inf rate. It's a percent. Unemployment rate. I've got unemployment rate. Percent again. So you see the relationship here. As the inflation rate falls, you'll see an increase in the unemployment rate. Okay, so this is called a trade-off, when you have to give up something to get something. So as the inflation rate increases, unemployment falls. Okay, that's the traditional view of this relationship. The LRPC, that's the long-run Phillips curve, is vertical. Okay, so for this question, you're just going to draw it somewhere in the middle, doesn't really matter where. And your short run, your SRPC, is going to intersect it at some point. And we're going to be putting the letter A to label a point that shows the current state of the economy in recession. So this is testing your knowledge of what the situation is like in the economy when you have a recession. When you have a recession, you're going to have higher than the natural rate of unemployment because of cyclical unemployment. So that means your your unemployment rate is going to be to the right of the LRPC. You will have higher unemployment and, in theory, lower inflation. So if we draw that here, we can put that anywhere over, say, around here, and we're just going to put the letter A. And that shows us the current state of unemployment in this economy. So moving on to part B, we're going to have to draw the most common graph in AP Macro, which is the ADAS graph. So let's draw that first, and we will look at what happens to it when we start to play around with fiscal and monetary policy. So this is what your ADAS graph should look like, something like this. So I've just written PL for price level. On the y-axis, we've got our GDP, real GDP on the x-axis. The question tells us that we are in recession, so that means we need our SRAS, our short-run aggregate supply curve, to cross or to intersect with the aggregate demand curve to the left of our long-run aggregate supply. This graph here tells us that this economy is in a recession. Okay, it's interesting that the little f in the YF, you can think of it as full employment, okay? And that would be, you're on your LRPC here. But look at this, we've got an intersection to the left of the LRAS here, which tells us also that our unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, okay? So if you're over here to the right on your Phillips, you're going to be over here to the left on your ADAS, okay? They're kind of like mirror images. So the next part of the question tells us, once we've done all this labeling here, which you get a couple of marks for, the government is going to try to balance the federal budget. Okay, balance means to make them equal, revenue and spending. So they're going to raise income taxes. So if you raise income taxes while you maintain the current level of spending, this is going to reduce aggregate demand. So if you just think about it, if we raise taxes, that means that people receiving salaries, for example, will have less money in their pocket after tax to purchase goods and services. So that means you will have less consumption. So that's going to shift our AD curve to the left. So, because remember your AD curve, you can think of that as GDP, which one of those components is the C in consumption. Okay. There's no change to the G, which is government spending, but there's going to be a decrease in C, so that's going to reduce aggregate demand. So let's just draw that right here. So something like this, and you label it whatever they tell you to label it, or if they don't tell you anything, just give it a logical name like 81. It's a good idea always to draw an arrow to show the direction of change. And we're going to label these new price levels PL2 and Y2 for the new output. This is not very neat, but you get the idea. Moving along to the, and you can see here, if you like, you could also include arrows. I'm not going to do it here, but on paper it would be easy enough to do. You could include a little arrow here showing that the price level has fallen. So that's deflation. And you've got a further contraction in the economy. So a further drop in real GDP or output. And that's going to mean even higher unemployment. A lower price level, but higher unemployment. That's your trade-off. Okay, so moving on to part D, it says assume the Fed uses monetary policy to stimulate. Okay, so what we just looked at here was the result of fiscal policy. That's government changing spending, taxes, or transfers. In this case, it was taxes that were changed. For the Fed, that's monetary policy. So we're going to be changing aggregate demand using interest rates. All right, so it asks us for the first part of Part D, what open market policy should the Federal Reserve implement? So what should they do? So this is going to be open market operations, and this is going to be buying bonds or buying securities. So by doing so, this will put more money into the reserves of banks, which can then be lent out to borrowers, and that carries on. And this will reduce, this reduction in the interest rate will stimulate aggregate demand, because when you have lower interest rates, this will mean that people will borrow in order to make interest-sensitive purchases, things like houses, cars, credit card also in a longer term, and also investment will obviously be the most immediately impacted. So the second part of Part D asks us to draw the money market. So we've got to draw a third graph in here. So we'll try to fit that in here on this screen. So the money market graph should look something like this. Basically, you've got your nominal interest rate on the y-axis. You've got your quantity of money on the x-axis. Starting out with the first position, MS is for money supply, QM, you can label them however you like. It doesn't seem to tell us precisely what labeling it wants. Money demand, MD, that's a downward sloping curve here. And then you're going to draw your starting interest rate, I or I1 or something, with dotted lines. Okay, we know if the Fed is buying bonds or securities to stimulate the economy, that's what question D tells us, they're going to be increasing the money supply. Okay, the money supply is determined by the Fed or the central bank, depending on the question you have. That's going to be shown graphically on the graph by a shift in the money supply curve to the right. So out here to this pink money supply curve out here. Notice I've drawn a little arrow here to indicate the direction. Also QM1, MS1. This will reduce the nominal interest rate from I1 to I2 and increase the money supply from MS to MS1. So this would be a fall in the nominal interest rate. That is what you need to write for an answer for part D2 here. That's the effect on the nominal interest rate. What will be the effect on the price level? Explain. If we decrease nominal interest rates, that's going to increase investment and interest rate sensitive consumption. So that will increase AD. So if we go back down here to our LRAS, our ADAS graph down here, that would involve us, if we had to draw this, we would draw another aggregate demand curve that's shifted to the right. So that would show an increase in the price level because of the higher investment and consumption that results from the fall in the nominal interest rate. So that would be our answer for that part there. The last part here, you don't have to draw anything. It asks us if nothing is done, if there's no Federal Reserve intervention, there's no policy action, what's going to happen? So it asks what will happen to the short-run aggregate supply curve in the long run. Okay, so what happens is if you've got high unemployment and other factors of production are not fully used, this fall in the price level indicates that they will become cheaper, and you will see an increase because costs of production are part of your short aggregate supply curve. Those costs of production fall. That's going to lead to higher production. So that's going to show up on your ADAS graph as a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Okay, and that will bring us back to or closer to the original position and ultimately to the the long-run aggregate supply curve. So if we were going to draw that, we don't have to draw it for this question. They're just asking for an explanation. But if we did, we would draw an SRAS curve right over here, SRAS 1, and this will bring the economy back to its long-run equilibrium in the long run. Okay. And the very last question here asks us about what's going to happen to the natural rate of unemployment. Well, nothing. Okay, so the natural rate of unemployment is what the economy can produce in terms of jobs. It does not include cyclical unemployment. What it does include is frictional unemployment. That is the unemployment that's associated with people changing jobs. You can never completely eliminate that. People are always going to be entering and leaving the workforce and changing jobs. Structural unemployment is related to a mismatch of skills of workers and the local economy. So that could be things like related to automation. It could be related to offshoring, factories and industries moving to other regions or countries. Neither of these are affected by the situation in question E, so there's no change to the natural rate of unemployment. To change the natural rate of unemployment, we would have to do something to change the frictional unemployment rate. That could be things like job matching, allowing people to find jobs more quickly, or something related to reducing structural unemployment. Possibly you might see a question that includes things like retraining programs, subsidies for relocation, and so on. But you don't have to explain. This question does not ask for an explanation, so all you need to say is that the natural rate of unemployment does not change as a result of these policy actions, or in this case, it's no policy action. So that concludes the question. So looking at each of these three graphs, we can approach this question from different perspectives, but you can see clearly how they're all related. The unemployment rate is captured in the Phillips curve graph, but it's also present in your ADAS graph. So if you can remember that as real GDP falls, unemployment increases, you can understand why we're moving down along that curve there on the Phillips graph. Similarly, when we have a decrease in the interest rate because of central bank intervention, that's going to lead to higher consumption related to lower interest rates and higher investment. That would shift our AD curve out to the right, and that would reduce unemployment. Okay. Now, one thing to note is that Part D here is based on what the Federal Reserve used to do, and there was a recent, I think it was a Planet Money podcast on NPR that pointed out that the AP macro exam is going to start including how the Fed actually engages in monetary policy, which is not exactly what is described in these earlier exams with open market operations. But you can check that out on NPR. I think it was on a Planet Money podcast in August of 2022. So that is a summary of this question. I hope it covers the basics, and of course, if you got any trouble with any of this, just go and dig deeper into that chapter and try to link. When you're looking at each of these graphs, think about how they're related to other graphs, and imagine what other graphs could be in a question like this. Things like foreign exchange or market for loanable funds. In this case, we've got these three graphs, but you definitely need to know them all for your AP. So that's it. I hope that was helpful, and good luck on your AP exams and in your economic studies.